Thank you for joining this session on 70 years, what Queen Elizabeth II means for us all. My name is Evan Fowler. I'm an Associate Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, which is a UK think tank here, and I'm delighted to be joined by three very well-known guests. So joining us via Zoom is Lord Robert Skidelsky. Lord Skidelsky is a member of the House of Lords and Professor Emeritus of Political Economy at the University of Warwick. He's the author of a three-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes, which I will add, I would consider still to be the definitive biography. So if you're interested in economic history, do read his work. He began his political career in the Labour Party before becoming the Conservative Party's spokesman for Treasury Affairs in the House of Lords. Lord Skidelsky was born in Harbin in China, and when the war broke out between Britain and Japan in December 1941, he and his parents were interned first in Manchuria and then in Japan before being released in a prisoner exchange. He then went back to China with his parents in 1947, living for a little over a year in Tianjin. Also with us today is Stephen Vines. So Stephen is an author, award-winning journalist and public speaker. He worked for The Observer and the Labour editor, covering the UK's biggest political and industrial stories in the 1980s. In 1987, Stephen moved to Hong Kong as the correspondent for The Observer and The Guardian, and in 1993 he was founding chief editor of Eastern Express, a newspaper I think some of us certainly sort of still remember. Before his abrupt departure from Hong Kong in 2021, he presented The Pulse, a current affairs television programme, as well as being a weekly contributor to the Morning Brew radio show, both of which were aired by the public broadcaster RTHK. And finally, I'm joined by Chip Tsao. Chip is a very well-known Hong Kong writer, screenwriter, director, dubbed, I quote, "the first talent in Hong Kong," knowledgeable, blending Chinese and Western cultures, and is famous for his spicy writing style. After graduating from studying in the United Kingdom in the 1980s, Chip served as a BBC reporter, and in 1991 returned to Hong Kong as Deputy Chief Editor of Ming Pao. He has worked as a columnist, host, commentator in many well-known media organisations, including Apple Daily, Oriental Daily, Headline Daily, and many others. And I'm very happy to be joined by my three guests. So thank you. So today we'll be discussing the legacy of the late Queen, Elizabeth II, who was, of course, the longest-serving British monarch in history, having ascended the throne in 1952 at the age of 25. I can certainly sort of speak as a Hong Konger myself. I didn't expect to sort of feel her passing in the way I did, and I remember when the news sort of came through to me, I did feel as though something that had been there, a constant in my life, had gone. Right. It was, she was more than just, I think, sort of an image. And I think today in our session, I would like to, along with our guests, sort of explore, why the Queen meant something, I think, for Hong Kong. Perhaps more broadly also thinking about what the Queen meant for the Commonwealth, an organisation that she gave a lot of her time, and indeed, having spoken to, I think, many Commonwealth diplomats, actually an awful lot of her heart and soul, I think, was really sort of put into that organisation. So just to sort of kick us off, I think maybe something light. Perhaps I could start with you, Lord Skidelsky. Do you have a particular story of the late Queen that to you really sort of summed up what was special about her?
Well, I think her very last act, in a way, she got up and appointed the new Prime Minister, and then went back to bed and then died. It's that sort of, you know, spirit of doing your duty and till the end. And I think that's one of the things that most of these commentators and obituaries have grasped, which is her dedication to duty. And of course her dedication to her multicultural inheritance, because the Commonwealth was an inherent of the old British Empire, but even after independence, people then joined, and others joined as well. So it represented an important force in the world, which was separate in its heyday, you know, separate from the two power blocks of the Cold War. It represented something else, an important thing, and I wonder whether it can endure without the Queen. That's the question, whether it will start breaking away. That's one last point. The Queen represented permanence in a very shifting world. But one of the things is that Hong Kongers never had any permanence. It was always temporary, their political situation. Obviously temporary in the sense of being temporary under the colonial regime, and also the two countries, one country, two systems was obviously temporary as well. So they never had the full assurance which the monarchy was able to give more permanent situations. But still, the Queen was very important.
And Chip, is there any story about the Queen that you felt was sort of most insightful?
Well, I mean, I never shared any moment with the Queen as intimately as the late David Tang claimed. The only Queen moment I was physically closest to her was photo occasion with Princess Anne, and also about a handshake at Barbican Centre with the late Princess Diana, and that's it. So it's almost a cliche to describe the Queen as a grandmother of the Commonwealth, as well as for the Hong Kong people. Yes, I was born in Hong Kong in 1958, and I was surrounded by portraits of the Queen, who was becoming aging, you know, through the decades, and she appeared as a sign everywhere, you know, in the midst of the trial uproar, you know, somewhere in the police station in Mong Kok. It doesn't mean that I had been inside, right? And to the immigration department, on the wall of a Christian secondary school on the island, and she was the omnipresence of the Queen. Made me feel that, well, I think many people felt that we were growing up in a very safe environment, in a safe city, especially when Hong Kong people had to undergo the turbulences of the 1967 riots and the Cultural Revolution. And I witnessed the floating dead bodies all the way from the Pearl River to the New Territories, and the portrait of the Queen was always behind. So it was a strange feeling. But for those BNO Hong Kongers who have just come back to this country, could get a little bit confused, because this country is in the 21st century. You may face a new generation of anti-monarchists. So it would sound a little bit paradoxical that when you claim at the same time a freedom fighter, however, a lover of the late Queen to some really radical people. So I think when you may have to practice a little bit of self-censorship when you touch upon such a topic, depending on where you are. In areas like Devonshire and Somerset, that's fine, right? But if you end up working in a factory under this climate, say Liverpool or Newcastle or Northampton or Luton, claiming yourself a loyal subject of the British Empire could put you in a bit of a danger. So, I mean, it's a very strange experience, especially as a Chinese and also an amateurish history lover. I think most of us would compare the Queen with some figureheads, similar female figureheads like the Empress Dowager and Madame Jiangqing in our own historical context, and feeling that, and finding that the Queen was such a novelty, and how lucky we had been born and living in Hong Kong, blessed by this Anglo-Saxon Queen rather than her Chinese peers. Right? So, I mean, that's it. Right? So, I mean, we all share the same feelings. Now, Steve might have a bit of a different opinion.
So we've certainly heard Chip's perspective here on that. Steve, when the Queen died, I mean, how did you feel at the time to her passing? And why do you think in Hong Kong there was that such a strong reaction to her death?
I have to say, I've never actually been a particular monarchist. I'm not against the monarchy, but I've never been particularly in favour of it. And if you think about Hong Kong, if you think about Hong Kong, it's the British colony that Britain never wanted. You know, when Hong Kong was occupied in 1841, the Foreign Office in London were appalled. They said, you know, all this business about we don't want a barren rock in the middle of nowhere. And it's a strange thing. Britain never really wanted to be in Hong Kong. It was convenient, it was useful for trade, and Britain never really built the kind of colony in Hong Kong that it built in, say, India or Kenya or Canada or these sort of places. But it was always there, as Chip says. There were portraits of the Queen everywhere. There's Victoria Park. Well, I think for most Hong Kong people, Victoria Park means commemorating Tiananmen. There's Prince Edward. Well, what do we think of when we think of Prince Edward? Certainly not the Queen. I think we think of what happened in the Prince Edward MTR. But all these names exist in Hong Kong, but they didn't mean much for the Brits. I think that was the point. Britain didn't have a great interest, this is the truth. Yet, Britain created, as Chip says, a long period of stability in Hong Kong, but it was all contradictory. You know, British rule was marked by racism, you know, no Chinese person could go and live on the Peak, that sort of thing. On the other hand, British rule gave countless people opportunities that they would never have had on the Chinese mainland. Britain granted a high degree of liberty to the people of Hong Kong, but no democracy to speak of, very limited democracy. So, you know, I think it's all very complicated. But can I just tell you one very funny story about the Queen? I've met her. I'm sure Lord Skidelsky's met her rather more often, but I've met her on just one occasion, which was in Thailand, when she went on a state visit. And I was working for The Independent then, and they had this strange thing where all of the correspondents were introduced to the Queen. That doesn't happen in London, incidentally. It only happens when she's overseas. And so I was one of the lesser correspondents, so I was put in a group with all these Thai correspondents, who in fact were all women, as it so happens. Now, in Thailand, the monarchy is so far above the people that nobody dares to speak to the king. In fact, you're supposed to crawl on the floor when you get anywhere close to the king. So the Queen came around, and she went around and she said, "This is so-and-so," and these Thai women were all standing there, trembling. They were literally trembling. The idea that the monarch would speak to them. And she goes round and she has this practice routine of saying, oh, who are you? Why do you? And the Thai people were completely incapable of saying anything. They were so shell-shocked by being confronted with the Queen. And I thought, oh my God, what is she going to do now? She just sailed through it. She just sailed through it. She had a way of dealing with these amazingly embarrassing situations. And so it went.
And
She had practice.
And I guess on the subject of practice, Lord Skidelsky, I've been seeing how that practice had changed, and what do you think sort of Elizabeth as a person sort of brought to the institution of monarchy during her reign?
Well, it became much. It's still quite formal and pompous in a way. It's the most. I don't know. I haven't experienced the monarchy in Thailand, but of the European monarchies, it's the most formal monarchy, and of course it does monarchical pageantry very, very well. It continues to do that. We don't have a monarch who goes to her work on a bicycle, as they do in, I think, one or two Scandinavian countries. So there's a lot of pomp still attached. How has it changed? It's become less pomp. Otherwise, and of course, it's become much more exposed than it used to be to the media. I mean, television, mass media. In a way, it's hard to see how it can survive with that degree of exposure, because every single member of the royal family is subject to scrutiny and very intrusive, and then a game is set up whereby they try to manipulate the publicity they get, but it's a sort of kind of corrupt deal. So the monarchy was always very remote in the past until the 50s and 60s. I remember it was the first time people saw coronation on the screen was in 1953, I think, of the royal coronation. It's the first time people saw, millions of people could see the Queen and the royal family. How they glimpsed them before. So I think all that changed, and I think it's very hard to keep a royal family going with a degree of respect and ritualistic adoration it requires in an age of mass media. And so I wonder how long it will go on for.
And Chip, as a Hong Konger, I've been certainly when you were speaking about the Queen, I think you were speaking about her sort of mostly as a figurehead, as a symbol, as something that was always present in Hong Kong. I mean, we had her on the notes, we had her portrait. I found it quite revealing that even my relatives in the US, when she passed away, they actually sort of phoned me up here in the UK, and they said, we have lost our head of state. And I was saying, uncle this and uncle, and auntie this. You're American now. And they were saying to me, they said no, but growing up in Hong Kong, we just felt that she symbolised something. She symbolised something that was very critical to who we are today. In many ways, the values we have, she was part of the fabric of the Hong Kong that ultimately shaped them. Do you think that's still the case in Hong Kong
I think
today?
so. I mean, from my experience, she symbolized simply civilization. There was a time in Hong Kong when people used to see the portrait of Chairman Mao to be hung on the wall somewhere alongside that of the Queen. There was this mini community of the Hong Kong left-wing or pro-communist groups. When you walk into a department store, like Hua Feng or the China department store, or some cinemas, screening mainland Chinese movies in the late 1960s and early 1970s. You saw the portrait of Chairman Mao within these buildings. Right? It was quite common. Right? But right away, I mean, in my childhood, I was shocked by the differences in my perception. And at least this was the lady in that portrait. She never commanded any personal cult. She never mobilized any red guards. She announced no slogans at all. She did not represent, in my vague perception, any ideology. Whereas the other old man, in that portrait, was such a strong symbol of God, very domineering, very aggressive, and sort of becoming a little bit scary and fearful, right? Because I was too young to understand what Maoism and Marxism were like. But whereas the portrait of the Queen meant nothing, right? It was all blank, but yet there was so much richness in it, right? Her crown and her more or less indifferent but aristocratic facial expression, right? and the way she was dressed compared with the Maoist suit, right? In that one, it was such a sharp contrast in visual images. Right? So it planted the seed in my mind, right, for further reflection and thinking, and also an interest in cultural studies that bothered me for almost the rest of my life. It was quite interesting, right? So that was my childhood experience of having lived alongside with the image of the Queen.
But how do you think that image, I mean, you describe the image as being sort of aristocratic. Surely for most people in Hong Kong,
yes,
it is also a very alien image. It is the image of, of a colonial
right.
power that
Exactly.
is instituted.
Like the Fortnum and Mason and the Hatchet bookshops in Piccadilly, right? There were places like Lane Crawford department store and the Jimmy's Kitchen, right? And some very posh, I don't know, Mandarin Hotel grill room or something, And immediately, when you walked into posh places like these, you could see these places were associated with a sense of civilization represented or symbolized by the Queen's portrait. Right? So it was a matter of childhood perception, a little bit vague. Right? However, it made such a big difference, for a child like me, who grew up in Hong Kong in the 1960s, because they were full of cultural shocks. On the newspaper stands, you could see newspapers and magazines, representing different political stands. They were shouting at each other, right? And cinemas screening films like Dr. Zhivago and David Lean's Lawrence Arabia, and others showing a documentary of the latest industrial achievements in the mainland, in the Red China. Right? I mean, for me, the Hong Kong in my childhood was such a treasure land of science, right? with such a richness that I didn't understand, but it inspired me so much when especially after I came back to this country, when the Queen actually appeared more often on BBC 6 o'clock news. And she became nearer and nearer. She was such an overwhelming shadow for me, yes.
Maybe if I could bring you in here. Why do you think people in Hong Kong were prepared to line up for 3 or 4 hours? Many of these people were people who hadn't experienced the colonial period, who were not brainwashed into loving the old colonial oppressor, yet they would line up to pay their respects to the late monarch.
I think that's very interesting. I think that's very interesting. Why did people do it? Well, one explanation is that in the new era of Hong Kong, it's very dangerous to do anything. So if you want a form of passive resistance where you won't immediately get arrested and somebody won't turn up on your doorstep at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's usually safe to go to something like a funeral or a commemoration. People understand that. I always think Hong Kong people are very smart and take an opportunity to show up, yes, to make a point. It was a good one. But I think there's something in what Chip said. You know, the Queen was, she didn't say. You didn't have to, you know, be like the murderer Mao. And I don't think that's an exaggeration, literally. Millions of people died on the Chinese mainland through the policies of Mao Zedong. But in Hong Kong, the Queen was the past. It was the past when you were free to say what you wanted to say. It was the past when you didn't have a telephone hotline to report on your neighbours. It was the past when 10,000 odd people hadn't been arrested for expressing their views in some way, which has happened now. So I think some of it is nostalgia for that time that had gone, but I think there is also an inherent respect for a system which didn't impose itself, which didn't tell you what you had to think. I mean, Britain was terrible at imposing its colonial history in Hong Kong. I don't think you didn't see people in schools in Hong Kong chanting, "I love the Queen, I want the Queen to reign forever." You didn't get all that nonsense. Well, fast forward to the current situation, and this is the sort of thing that's now happening in schools. And people appreciate that, and they, I think, yearn for a past. I mean, isn't it an extraordinary thing that even before, this is well before the Queen died, when there was in 1997, when the colonial governor sailed off on the Queen's yacht, Britannia, and the first Chinese leader of Hong Kong, Tung Chee-hwa, came in, popularity, opinion polls showed that more people liked the departing colonial oppressor than they did the incoming Chinese leader. I mean, it was an extraordinary thing. I can't think of any other colony you can speak of that transferred out of British rule where the new leader was less popular than the outgoing governor. I mean, you think of India, there was a small matter of a civil war, but, you know, it wasn't that they wanted the Brits back, they just wanted somebody else in control of India. Hong Kong is staggeringly unusual in this, that people did appreciate that system. They might not have loved it, but I think they liked the comfort of the reassurance. And of course, if Britain did nothing else, it brought rule of law. And this was the thing that even people who didn't have any active political involvement appreciated. You go into a court of law and you have a pretty good chance of achieving justice. This is history, unfortunately, now.